Hello. As you can see from this slide, my name is Brian Hunter, and I'm hoping that by having these simplistic slides, there won't be too much distraction and it should be a little bit more accessible for all people. Let's dive into the first question. And that question was, how did the institutionalization impact the disability rights movement? Now you'll notice on these slides I've included a lot of information. Not that I'll read exactly from the slide, but assuming that the closed captioning doesn't capture exactly the essence, I'm hoping that these informative slides will do that for those that cannot hear what I'm saying. Now, institutionalization was a common practice in the early education movement, starting as early as the 19th century. It was a way to exclude those that were perhaps more difficult or burdensome to educate for the public school system. Now, as challenges to all forms of separation of students began predominantly, and most would say the landmark case would be Brown versus Board of Education, this helped to create the legal framework for the challenge of the exclusion of these people with disabilities. Additionally, Robert F. Kennedy went and visited one of these in New York and was quoted as saying that they're a literal snake pit, which helped to bring attention to the conditions that people with disabilities were being required to deal with. And something interesting as I did my own research is that even into the 1970s, we're talking less than 60 years ago, people were still legally forced into institutionalization depending on their disabilities. And I found this from the Missouri History Museum. So, seeing that this exclusion was happening drove a force and got the public involved in wanting to change these things, as they saw that these conditions were simply abhorrent. Now, in the second question, we were shown some clips of peaceful protests. The main ones that you saw in there were the sit-ins in San Francisco. You might have seen them carrying the signs for 504. Of course, dealing with the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and the fact that it was not being enforced. Now, the vision these people had was that these protests could lead to changes for the disabled community and its members. It could lead to actual enforcement of the books that were on the law at the time during the sit-ins. And that through this, people with disabilities would have the opportunity to live a more fulfilling life. The other one you saw was later deemed the quote-unquote Capitol crawl, where protesters ditched their wheelchairs, canes, and other mobility tools and tried to climb the Capitol steps, making a literal representation of the inaccessibility that these individuals deal with on a day-to-day basis. Now, what this ultimately led to was the enforcement of Section 504 as a result of the sit-ins, which, as Kitty Cohn pointed out in her article, The 504 Sit-ins, A Brief History, that it led to concrete federal civil rights protections. The literal enforcement that you cannot be discriminated against by your disability for any entity receiving federal funding. The Capitol crawl, on the other hand, helped force through legislation later signed by George H.W. Bush, known as the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, which we'll talk about on this next slide. Now, in the video, one of the interviewees was quoted as saying that it was the Emancipation Proclamation for individuals with disabilities. She, of course, was referring to the Americans with Disability Act, the ADA. Now, this is from the U.S. Department of Labor. This is an exact quote. The Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities in several areas, including employment, transportation, public accommodations, communities, and access to state and local government programs and services. So it extended beyond the 504 to local and state levels, whereas 504 mostly referred to the federal. Now, it would seem clear why she might consider this the Emancipation Proclamation, as the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves, but this quite literally gave freedom to live a less barriered life to people with disabilities. It gave them access to things that before were just not a reality, as sad as that is to say. It literally gave them their freedom. Now, what does this look like for us as future educators? I took a lot of my inspiration from the video from Tori Dunlap on the TEDx talk entitled, as you can see here, "Isn't it a pity? The real problem with special needs." And in it, she talks about how, well, on the surface, these events such as the special rodeo, she says, or the prom for those with special needs, that, well, on the surface, it says, well, this is great. This is just for them. But for us to look and say, well, what does that say to these individuals, these students that we have that do have these disabilities? Well, it says to them, we have to do stuff that's special from you and exclude you from your peers. As a leader, what we need to be looking at is, as she says, we shouldn't be looking to create separate events, but rather we should address the barriers that prevent these students with disabilities from participating. And we need to change the way we look at it. As a disability is not something to be pitied or to feel bad about or to be fixed, but rather as a neutral, just as a part of their existence. Similar to saying, well, that student has brown hair. It's not positive, it's not negative, it is. And that comes to my final thing. We need to not fix the child. We can't say, well, if we do this, this will happen. Instead, we need to look at the system and say, why are there so many barriers? And what can we do so that the students that we have can participate on an equal footing with their peers? What barriers must be eliminated? Thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing your feedback and your comments. Have a great day.